The afternoon sun beat down on the tarmac of Cleveland Municipal Airport on September 5, 1949, illuminating a spectacle that marked the zenith of a golden, dangerous age. More than 72,000 spectators had gathered, their eyes fixed on the sky, waiting for the roar of engines that defined the post-war era. They were there for the Thompson Trophy race, the premier event of air racing, but they were about to witness the violent end of a chapter in aviation history. The center of attention was a P-51 Mustang, but not one that looked like the rugged escort fighters that had roamed the skies over Berlin a few years prior. This machine, named Begin, was a radical modification, a testament to the speed-obsessed culture that had emerged from the surplus of war. It was piloted by Bill Odom, a man whose reputation as a legendary aviator was built on endurance. Having circumnavigated the globe in just over 73 hours, he was a master of the long haul, a Bendix pilot. Yet here he was, strapped into a volatile Sprinter, attempting to force a machine built for high-altitude combat to dance around pylons at sea level. To the aircraft itself was a marvel of aerodynamic sculpture. Its radiator, usually a scoop on the belly, had been relocated to the wingtips to reduce drag, and the fuselage was smoothed over, erasing the industrial scars of mass production. It was built for one thing: to exceed 400 miles per hour on a closed course. As the race entered its second lap, the physics of flight and the unforgiving nature of low-level racing collided with tragic consequences. Odom, perhaps unfamiliar with the violent twitchiness of pylon racing compared to the steady cruise of cross-country flying, cut inside pylon number 3. In a desperate attempt to correct his line toward pylon 4, the Mustang betrayed him. It rolled inverted, hanging upside down for a heart-stopping moment that seemed to stretch into eternity for the horrified crowd. Then, gravity reclaimed the machine. The aircraft plunged downward, not into an open field, but into a residential neighborhood in nearby Berea, Ohio. The impact was catastrophic. The plane slammed into a house on West Street, instantly killing Odom. Inside the home, Jean Laird and her 13-month-old son, Craig, also perished. The cruel irony was that the family had moved into the house only 4 days earlier. The explosion and subsequent fire consumed the structure as 72,000 people watched the plume of smoke rise, marking a gruesome punctuation mark to the festivities. The race continued despite the carnage, with Cook Cleveland taking the victory in a massive Goodyear F2G Super Corsair, but the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. When reporters later pressed Cleveland for his thoughts, his assessment was brutal and devoid of sentimentality. He asserted that Odom belonged in cross-country racing, not on the pylon course. He argued that the temperament required for the two disciplines was vastly different, and that Odom had been in the wrong race. The crash did more than just claim 3 lives. It effectively killed the golden age of Cleveland air racing. The proximity of the disaster to a residential area sparked a public outcry that forced the event's cancellation in future years. The P-51 Mustang, the darling of the racing circuit, was pushed into the shadows. Critics and military strategists alike looked at the propeller-driven fighter as a relic, a dangerous anachronism in a world rapidly transitioning to the sleek, whistling promise of the jet age. However, those who believed the Mustang's story ended in the smoking crater in Berea were mistaken. The aircraft, which had swept the Luftwaffe from the skies of Europe, was not ready to die. It was about to embark on a second life, a diaspora that would see it fighting in Korea, cutting wires in the Sinai, and serving in air forces across 6 continents for another 4 decades. For to understand the improbable survival of the P-51, one must look at the industrial aftermath of World War II. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the United States possessed an air armada of unprecedented size, a force that suddenly had no enemy to fight. North American aviation had produced Mustangs at a staggering rate, churning out over 100 aircraft per week at peak production in Inglewood, California. With the war over, the assembly lines ground to a halt, and the military was left with thousands of high-performance fighters that were expensive to store and maintain. The government's solution was a pragmatic, ruthless program of destruction. Across the globe, from depots in Europe to the deserts of the American Southwest, vast graveyards of aluminum formed. Crews armed with acetylene torches and heavy machinery began the work of dismantling the most potent air force in history. At Calero Field near Chino, California, a high school senior named Ed Maloney witnessed this industrial slaughter firsthand. While his peers were interested in sports or cars, Maloney was obsessed with aviation. Having spent his youth building models and collecting data, he watched with a sickening sense of loss as cranes dropped 18-foot steel plates onto the fuselages of B-17s and B-24s, snapping the mighty bombers like dry twigs. He saw Mustangs, which had cost the government approximately $51,000 each to manufacture, a small fortune in the 1940s, being sold for scrap or auctioned to the public for as little as $1,500. It was a fire sale of epic proportions. A functioning fighter plane could be bought for less than the price of a new automobile. Maloney watched as mountains of technical manuals, the accumulated knowledge of a generation of aeronautical engineering, were doused in fuel and set ablaze. He rescued what he could, loading his car with documents, a small act of defiance that would seed a lifelong crusade to preserve aviation history. While the United States was busy turning its swords into plowshares or simply scrap metal, the geopolitical landscape was shifting. The newly formed United States Air Force was entirely focused on the future, which they believed belonged to the jet engine. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, operational since 1944, offered speeds that made piston engines look like relics of a bygone era. The military doctrine of the late 1940s assumed that any future conflict would be a high-sped, high-altitude engagement, likely involving nuclear weapons. The propeller fighter was viewed as obsolete, a nostalgic toy with no place on the modern battlefield. Hundreds of Mustangs were transferred to the Air National Guard, or sold to foreign nations for nominal fees under treaties like the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. The Swiss Air Force, for example, purchased 130 surplus Mustangs for roughly $4,000 each, a bargain that allowed them to modernize their fleet until the late 1950s. Then came the morning of June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army surged across the 38th parallel, shattering the peace of the post-war world. They brought with them Soviet-built T-34 tanks, and a level of aggression that caused the South Korean defenses to collapse almost instantly. The United States, scrambling to respond from bases in Japan, quickly discovered that their vision of a jet-powered future was incompatible with the dirty reality of the Korean peninsula. The P-80 Shooting Stars were fast, certainly, but they were thirsty. A mission from Japan to Korea burned so much fuel that the jets had mere minutes of loiter time over the target area before they had to turn back. Furthermore, the delicate jet engines were prone to ingesting debris, and the primitive, cratered airstrips of Korea were death traps for the new technology. The pilots needed to get low and slow to identify camouflage targets in the rugged terrain, a task for which the fast-moving jets were ill-suited. In a twist of irony, the Air Force realized that the obsolete aircraft they had been scrapping was exactly the weapon they needed. The P-51 Mustang could carry a heavy ordnance load up to 1,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, or napalm. It could operate from rough dirt strips that would wreck a jet. Most importantly, it could loiter over the battlefield for hours, providing sustained close air support to the beleaguered ground troops. The call went out to the Air National Guard units and storage depots. Crews worked frantically to preserve the aircraft, stripping away protective coatings and bringing the dormant Merlin engines back to life. The aircraft carrier USS Boxer was loaded with 145 Mustangs and sprinted across the Pacific, setting a record by arriving in Japan in just 8 days and 7 hours. 5. The Mustang was going back to war, redesignated as the F-51 under the new Air Force nomenclature. The aircraft faced a brutal environment. The romantic notion of knights of the air dueling at 25,000 feet was gone. This was a grimy low-level war against trucks, tanks, and supply lines. Pilots like Lieutenant E.H.L. Sath found themselves flying with the Republic of Korea Air Force, serving as advisors and combat leaders. Sath's experience, on July 10, 1950, encapsulated the chaotic nature of this new conflict. After a radio failure severed his contact with his flight, he spotted North Korean armor on a road below. Acting alone, he dove on a tank and destroyed it, then proceeded to shoot up a convoy of trucks until his ammunition was exhausted. Forced to land at a forward base, he spent 5 days hitchhiking back to his unit. This was the daily reality: improvisation, danger, and relentless ground attack. However, this new role exposed the Mustang's greatest weakness. The aircraft had been designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, where its liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine performed brilliantly in the thin air. But down in the mud and dust of Korea, that liquid cooling system became a liability. The engine relied on a radiator and a network of coolant lines. 6. A single bullet from a peasant's rifle could puncture the system. Once the coolant leaked out, the engine would seize within minutes, turning the aircraft into a gliding brick. Unlike the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt or the Navy's F-4U Corsair, which used air-cooled radial engines that could absorb tremendous punishment and keep running, the Mustang was fragile. 7 pilots knew that if they took a hit in the cooling system, they had seconds to make a decision: bail out or crash. The statistics were grim. The United States lost 335 Mustangs in Korea. Of those, 172 were brought down by ground fire, while only 10 were lost to enemy jets. The rest were claimed by accidents, often exacerbated by the brutal Korean winter. The Mustangs lacked effective dicing gear, and an overloaded fighter accumulating ice at low altitude was a coffin. Despite the losses, the Mustang terrified the enemy. North Korean troops learned to dread the distinctive whistle of the Mustang in a dive. They feared the napalm canisters tumbling from its wings, weapons that unleashed a fire so intense it could melt the rubber tires off tanks. The effectiveness of the F-51 forced the enemy to move only at night, and to camouflage their positions with fanatical discipline, driving tanks into haystacks and burying trucks to hide them from the prowling piston fighters. Other nations joined the fray in Mustangs. The Royal Australian Air Force and the South African Air Force flew the type with distinction, suffering heavy casualties but earning a reputation for precision and bravery. 8. The South Koreans themselves flew the Mustang as their primary fighter, piloted by men fighting for the very survival of their homeland, some of whom were veterans of the Japanese military from the previous war. 9. By 1953, the jets had finally matured enough to take over. The F-84 Thunderjet and F-86 Sabre assumed the burden of the air war, and the Mustangs were slowly phased out of American service. The last American Air Force Mustang was retired in 1957, destined for a museum. 10. But while America was finished with the P-51, the rest of the world was just getting started. In the Middle East, a fledgling nation was fighting for its existence, and the Mustang would play a pivotal role. Israel, declared independent in 1948, faced invasion from all sides and possessed almost no air force. Agents scoured the globe for aircraft, navigating arms embargoes and political blockades. In the United States, they managed to purchase 4 Mustangs. To smuggle them out, they created the massive fighters and labeled them as agricultural combines, relying on the hope that customs inspectors would not question why farm equipment weighed 3 tons and was shaped like an airplane. The Israeli Mustangs, assembled in secret among orange groves, immediately altered the balance of power. They possessed the range to strike Cairo and Damascus, a capability no other aircraft in the region could match. They flew reconnaissance, interception, and ground attack missions. 11 in one notable engagement. An American volunteer pilot named Wayne Peake intercepted a high-flying British Mosquito reconnaissance plane that had been operating with impunity over Israel. Peake climbed to altitude and shot it down, signaling that Israeli airspace was no longer open. The Mustang's versatility was further proven during the 1956 Suez Crisis. 12. In a mission that sounds like fiction, Israeli pilots were tasked with disrupting Egyptian command and control by severing telephone lines in the Sinai Desert. They flew their Mustangs at treetop level, dragging weighted cables to snag the wires. When the devices failed, the pilots, displaying near-suicidal bravery, used their propellers and wings to physically slice through the communication lines, cutting off Egyptian commanders from their troops at a critical moment. The Mustang's journey continued through the decades, serving as a tool of state power in the Philippines, Indonesia, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. It became a favorite of counterinsurgency operations, its long loiter time and heavy firepower making it ideal for suppressing rebellions in jungles and archipelagos. In Indonesia, a P-51 flown by Captain Ignatius Duanto scored a rare kill against a CIA-backed B-26 Invader flown by an American mercenary, marking the only confirmed aerial victory in the Indonesian Air Force's history. The Dominican Republic operated Mustangs longer than anyone else, keeping them in service until 1984.13. These Caribbean warriors, adorned with shark-mouth nose art, served as the primary aerial deterrent for the island nation. Outlasting the Vampire jets that were supposed to replace them, they flew against Cuban naval incursions and internal revolts, a testament to the airframe's durability and the ingenuity of the mechanics who kept them flying without factory support. Perhaps the most surreal chapter in the Mustang's post-war history occurred in Central America in 1969. Tensions between El Salvador and Honduras, fueled by land disputes and migration issues, exploded following a series of violent soccer matches during the World Cup qualifiers. The ensuing football war saw the last dogfights between piston-engine fighters in history. Both sides operated World War II vintage aircraft. Honduras flew the bent-wing F-4U Corsair, while El Salvador fielded Goodyear-built Corsairs and a handful of Cavalier Mustangs airframes that had been modernized in Florida with wingtip tanks and updated avionics. On July 17, 1969, Honduran Captain Fernando Soto, flying a Corsair, engaged a flight of Salvadoran Mustangs. 14. In a swirling melee over the jungle, Soto shot down one Mustang and then, moments later, destroyed a second one. He went on to shoot down a Corsair later that day, achieving 3 kills in a single mission. It was a time warp, a combat engagement that belonged in 1945, playing out a quarter-century later. It was the final, violent curtain call for the piston-engine fighter in air-to-air combat. While the Mustang was fighting these brushfire wars, back in the United States, a different kind of revival was taking place. The ban on surplus military aircraft in air racing, instituted after the tragedy of 1949, was lifted in the mid-1960s with the birth of the Reno air races. In the high desert of Nevada, the P-51 found a new home. A new generation of pilots and engineers began to modify the airframes, pushing them far beyond their original design limits. They clipped wings to increase roll rates, streamlined canopies, and tuned the Merlin engines to produce 3,000 horsepower, double their wartime output. Aircraft with names like Strega, Voodoo, and Dago Red became legends, screaming around the pylons at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The sound of a modified Mustang at full throttle, a visceral, earth-shaking howl, became the anthem of the unlimited class at Reno. Parallel to the racing scene, a preservation movement began to take root. The man who had watched the destruction at Calero Field, Ed Maloney, never wavered in his commitment. He opened his collection to the public in 1957, the first air museum west of the Rockies. His persistence inspired others. Over the decades, the perception of the Mustang shifted from obsolete scrap to historical treasure. Enthusiasts tracked down airframes in remote jungles and forgotten depots. They negotiated with foreign governments to repatriate the aircraft that had been sold for pennies. The restoration of these machines became an art form. Shops sprang up specializing in the arcane skills required to form aluminum and rebuild 12-cylinder engines. The value of the aircraft skyrocketed. A plane that could once be bought for $1,500 now commands millions of dollars. Today, there are more than 160 airworthy P-51 Mustangs worldwide. They are not just machines. They are time capsules. Some, like Sierra Sioux 2, have been restored to a level of authenticity that rivals the day they rolled off the factory line, with every bolt and rivet verified. Others continue to push the envelope of performance in the racing circuit. They are flown by movie stars and retired airline pilots, by the sons and grandsons of of the men who took them to war. The factories closed 80 years ago, but the P-51 Mustang refuses to fade into history. It survived the scrapping torches, the freezing winters of Korea, the heat of the Sinai, and the jungles of Central America. It outlived the pilots who doubted it and the enemies who feared it. It remains a symbol of an era where form followed function in the most beautiful way possible, a testament to the enduring legacy of a machine that simply would not die.